War is hell. Mother Nature is the great equalizer. So what happens when you put a threat of war and Mother Nature into a blender and hit high speed? Well, you may get what happened in Samoa in March of 1889. Some background: Samoa was a set of islands in the Pacific, settled by Polynesians about 1000 BCE. I'm only saying was because, yes, it still exists, but has gone through name changes. Anyway, primarily they lived in villages ruled by chiefs. Europeans, with a case of the look-arounds, arrived in 1722 and at first were welcome with the kinds of things they brought, supplies and technology for that time, and a foreign settlement developed around Apia Harbor in the 1850s. But then here comes all of these other settlers from the United States, Great Britain, and Germany, all who eventually wanted to annex Samoa for themselves in some form or fashion. This, along with infighting between some villages and stirring things up with the three countries, were messing up Samoa's desire to have a national government. U.S. signed a treaty in 1878 to have a naval station in Pago Pago Harbor, which is now part of American Samoa. Great Britain and Germany would do something similar within a year. Well, then the inevitable happens because you can't have peace easily. I'm not going to get so much into the war part of this, but the first Samoan Civil War started in 1886 regarding who was going to be the next king of Samoa, and of course the countries who wanted to annex are interested. We've got a few warships from the U.S. and a few warships from Germany and one from Great Britain hanging out in Apia Harbor in a kind of standoff and trying to keep their own interests secure in the Samoan Islands. The village of Apia has a harbor that is about a half-mile wide at the mouth and about 3/4 mile long. The sides of the harbor are coral reefs. Near the head of the bay is the Vaisugano River. Well, Mother Nature, feeling a bit frisky, perhaps deciding that this was not the time for a war, lads, well, she did some stuff. On March 14th, barometric pressure started to fall. Those are your millibars, and usually an indication that a low pressure system in the area is being formed and growing. In the harbor at Apia, we've got 3 U.S. warships, USS Vandalia, USS Nipsic, and the newly arrived USS Trenton. We've got 3 German warships, the SMS Olga, SMS Iba, and the SMS Adler. And we have the British warship, the HMS Calliope. The Navy had a chat with the locals and were told not to worry. This area had storms several times a year. May get some rain, but not any gale force winds. The next morning, barometer, she's falling again, which is not normal if you believe a storm should be going away. Some of the lead officers of their respective ships are thinking that they need to be heading out to sea to ride the storm out. But again, the locals are telling them there were no worries. And also, I don't doubt that some of the ships don't want to leave in case another country takes advantage of their absence if there actually wasn't a storm, or not much of one. This is 1889. At this period of time, there was little in the way of getting a weather report. And that river that empties into the bay, they didn't know that when there were flooding rains, the Vaisugano River could let out a slew of water into the bay that would lift up the silt off the bottom, and their anchors would no longer be anchored into anything because what would be left was bare coral rock. The afternoon of March 15th, all ships prepared as best they could for a storm, and within a couple of hours the winds came in and the seas rose. Now, as per usual, some accounts of the storm and when things happened and to what ship they happened aren't quite in line, maybe out of order, but I think the end result is generally factual. Let's talk about our ships first. United States, the Vandalia, bark-rigged wooden vessel. The Trenton, ship-rigged wooden vessel. Nipsic, the bark-rigged wooden vessel and the smallest of the 3 ships. For Germany, Olga, probably the most formidable of the German warships, a corvette, which back then was a small 3-masted ship with square rigging like a frigate. Iba, I believe, was a bark-rigged steamer, and Adler, I believe, was a gunboat. Sorry, I don't have any additional information on those. For the British Empire was the Calliope, a Calypso-class corvette. I believe in addition to those, there were about 10 or so other vessels, not of the war type, that were in the harbor at the same time. The U.S. Vandalia was said to be the first to drag anchor, but the German Eva was the first to go ashore as the other ships watched, with the propeller damaged and anchors unable to latch onto anything. The ship got hung up under the overhanging reef, and because the reef held the boat in place, imagine a kid playing with a toy boat and holding that boat halfway down into the water with his hand. Water flooded the hull and promptly sank the ship, drowning all men inside. Midnight that night, the U.S. Trenton had 4 anchors dug in and engines at full speed and tried to maintain position through shifting winds. March 16th, 5 a.m., the German boat Olga with steam power going, but then the anchor let go, and the ship crashed into the U.S. Nipsic, smokestack going overboard. Olga then struck the British Calliope. By 7 a.m., Trenton had lost her rudder, and the hawse pipe let go. It has to do with the anchor and keeping water out of the ship. Water rushed into the boat until an improvised band-aid could be rendered in the interior to slow down the flood. Nipsic, having lost the smokestack and unable to keep steam up, the commander drove the Nipsic onto the beach. German Adler, stern almost on the reef, gambled on a high wave to try to heave the Adler onto the reef, and it worked. The British Calliope, with ships in the area threatening his livelihood, with waves out of control, 3 of 4 anchors let loose, Captain King decided he had 2 options: try to beach beside the Nipsic or head out to sea. Asking the engine room to give him all power, he headed out to sea with all the power he could muster, given the power of the ocean. As the Calliope passed the Trenton, 400 men from the ship shouted and gave 3 hearty cheers for the Calliope, who responded back with a 3 cheers for the Trenton and the American flag. At 11 a.m., Vandalia's stern struck a reef, but thanks to the power of the river's flow, her bow swung to the right and she sank in water that still kept the masts clear above the ocean and of the reef overhang. The commander was washed overboard and drowned. Crew climbed the rigging and stayed there for hours throughout the storm. Noon, Trenton began to take on water. Only one of the anchor cables held, and by 4 p.m. she collided with the German Olga, the only ship seemingly to have a chance, but the collision destroyed Olga's cables, and the captain ran her up onto the beach to save her. 10 p.m., the Trenton was caught in the water from the river coming into the bay and grounded down beside the Vandalia. One bright spot was that it provided a bit of a refuge for the Vandalia's sailors who were still clinging for their lives to the Vandalia's rigging. Hundreds of people stood on the beach and watched the awful spectacle in the harbor. And when all was said and done by Mother Nature, after 29 hours of storm, nearly 150 men died. The Vandalia lost 43, 4 officers and 39 men, including Captain Schoonmaker with 15 years of sea service. Again, they had a bark-rigged wooden. The boat was carried right upon a reef, struck hard, the captain being hurled against a Gatling gun, and he fell. Before he could recover himself, a great wave hit the deck, and he was washed down into sea with others. The vessel sank 50 yards from the Nipsic. Nipsic lost 7, said that 5 of the men died from the swamping of the boat, and the other 2 had jumped overboard and drowned. She had dragged her anchors and shifted to shore. Captain ran her on a sandbank. Boats were lowered, and all other men were saved. Trenton, 1 lost. Ship-rigged wooden, broke from anchor and driven up onto the Vandalia wreck, which destroyed the bottom, and her hold was half full of water. The Olga lost no one, had actually withstood the gale even though beaten up, but the constant heavy seas finally drove her onto the beach as morning came. The Calliope was able to get out into open sea. Between the Eva and the Adler, they lost 93 men. From the Eva, 5 were ashore during the storm. All others, about 73, were on board when the ship struck the reef and sank. From the Adler, 20 were lost. After Eva, the next to be attacked by the storm, lifted by a wave and cast on her beam ends on the reef. Some sailors reached the shore, but many didn't, particularly those that were clinging to the rigging as the masts soon fell. Aside from those, the German bark Peter Godfrey, which came from Sydney, and 7 to 9 other coasters were wrecked. 4 lives were lost from this group. From the Cheyenne Daily Leader, the New York Associated Press. Quote, "The most violent and destructive hurricane ever known in the South Pacific passed over these islands on the 16th and 17th of March. I think it was actually the 15th and 16th. And as a result, the fleet of 6 warships and 10 other vessels were ground to atoms on the coral reefs of the harbor or thrown on the beach in front of Apia. The United States frigate Trenton, flagship of the Pacific Squadron, lies within a stone's throw of the American consulate, a total wreck. The great hull of the magnificent vessel, which steamed into the harbor a few weeks ago, rests on the bottom, fast going to pieces. The United States steamer Vandalia is buried out of sight between the Trenton and the shore. Her shattered foremast and smokestack rise from the water to mark the spot where the gallant vessel struck and lay for 12 hours before the awful torrent of water swept 4 officers and 39 men from the deck and rigging. The United States steamer Nipsic lay for several days alongside the Vandalia with her bow high on the beach and within 5 feet of the water's edge. This vessel, though badly damaged, was hauled off a few days after the storm and is the only warship afloat in the harbor. The 3 American men of war were swept ashore almost at the same spot." End quote. The natives rendered every assistance, Americans and Germans being treated alike. The damage on shore was also very great. Houses were unroofed and blown down, and trees and fences were thrown across the streets so that passage was almost blocked. From the Telegraph Courier, April 18, 1889. Quote, "Most of the Trenton's crew remained aboard of her after the storm subsided, and work was begun to lighten her and pump her out, but it is feared she was badly broken below. All the inhabitants united in rendering aid to the shipwrecked sailors, many of whom are sheltered in tents in Apia. Admiral Kimberly remained with the Trenton. Admiral Kimberly contacted the Navy Department and relayed the numbers and names of the American dead, numbers of German, gave an account of the status of all ships involved, including the German ships. Quote, "It is important to send 300 men home at once." End quote. Chief Lee, who I believe is of the State Department, said, quote, "The cablegram from the Admiral has been laid before the Secretary of the Navy, who expresses the deepest regret at the appalling calamity that has befallen both Germany and America in the loss of so many brave men. The rifling loss of the war vessels is of no importance whatever and will scarcely attract attention. The families of the brave fellows who went down in the frightful hurricane on that faraway shore will have the sympathy of the entire nation." End quote. R.M. Corwine received cablegram from his brother John, past assistant paymaster on the Nipsic, and received this, quote, "Auckland, New Zealand, Nipsic on shore at Apia, all officers saved and well." End quote. John had a list of wives and relatives of the sailors and sent telegrams as soon as he could. The following dispatch has been sent to Lieutenant Wilson for Admiral Kimberly, care of the consul at Auckland. Quote, "Take such steps with regards to the Nipsic and wrecks and sending of men home as you may deem proper. Full power is given you." So obviously this was a hurricane. At least one, anyway. Without the slew of weather instruments afforded us now, they were relying on not much base in the time. Lieutenant G.L. Dyer, U.S. Navy hydrographer. Quote, "The hurricane that struck Samoa with such furious intensity on the 15th probably originated some 300 miles to the northeastward of the islands. It moved rapidly southwestward directly towards them. The center of the hurricane, however, must have passed directly over or very near the harbor, and in the case of a very severe tropical cyclone, as this must have been, absolutely nothing can resist its fury." End quote. Admiral Kimberly wrote the Chief of Bureau of Navigation at the Navy about his own observations, pointing out the odd measurements of 2 low barometer readings of equal millibars with 24 hours in between. Others would say that they believe that this was one of a series of storms in this area. The first one may have been around March 5th, 500 miles north-northeast of the island, going southwest. But when it was about 150 to 200 miles to the west of the island, it turned and went southeast between Tonga and Niue, and was felt in Apia around March 6th. Then this tragic storm was allegedly formed around the 13th, 300 miles northeast of the island, and on the 15th the hurricane's eye passed either directly over or a little north of the harbor and on a southwestern course. But then it possibly curved back around and passed over Apia again on the 16th, hence the 2 separately low pressure system levels within 24 hours. Some refute this theory, of course. So what was it really? People are honestly still looking into it. Now back to the news. April 1st, Navy Department to keep U.S. representation in Samoa is sending out the Richmond, Alert, and Adams warships to Apia. April 4th, the British Calliope has arrived in Sydney. April 13th, the German Olga has arrived in Sydney for repairs. She brought the commander, 2 officers, and 30 of the crew of the Adler. The U.S. Rockton ship is in Sydney and will head to Samoa to pick up the crews of the U.S. ships and take them to San Francisco. Burials of recovered bodies are happening. The German Lübeck ship arrived from Samoa to Sydney, carrying officers of the EBA. They will head to Germany on the steamer Habsburg, which is leaving April 24th. 100 men from Germany will stay in Apia to guard their interests. June 16th, King Mataafa of Samoa will be sent a Navy Yard-built whaleboat from the U.S. Navy Department, along with a letter from President Harrison as a thank you for his valuable services in saving lives and property, and his bravery and the bravery of his men in rescuing so many soldiers. June 26th. Nipsic is heading for San Francisco with the ship The Alert. Will make a stop at Honolulu on its way. Temporary repairs will be made prior to starting out so that it can try to make the voyage. Nipsic arrived in Honolulu in August, undergoing repairs. The officers and men are living on the ship and repairs are happening quickly. October 4th. Crews of the Adler and EBA have arrived in Germany. July 4th, 1891. The remains of 19 soldiers were interred at the Naval Cemetery on Mare Island with religious services, and a parting salute was fired and last call was played on a bugle. Letter from William Churchill, former U.S. Consul General to Samoa, to Lieutenant Commander E.L. Beach of U.S. Navy, Annapolis. The letter was mainly in recognition of the chief of Apia, Mataafa, and his wife, Fa'utulia. He goes on to relay the tales of the ships during the storm. Quote, hope for the ship, I believe it was the Trenton, there was none, for her company there seemed less. Out into that hell of waters one man inched his way, one hand holding out a hero clutch over that dark turmoil, and not the stronger hand the left behind him in the firm brown clasp of a trusty tribesman. Barefooted he won a footing on the jagged coral. As well might one elect to tread on broken bottles, and in that mill race set his form against the send of the mighty seat. Into the tumult followed upon his chief the second man, one hand holding his leader, one hand grasping both to sure, hand clasped upon the shore. Brave man by brave man, this chain linked out from the beach, each bare foot taloning the jagged reef, each breast in man's triumph over nature the brute, buffeting back the waters. These Samoans paid out the line of their generously jeopardized lives, the lifeline for the Trenton, until their leader was barely holding his own, his head awash. Yet his one free hand was ever reaching blindly in the dark and deadly turmoil, and what he seized he held, a Trenton man snatched from death, and passed him back along the line from one mighty arm to the next, and so to shore, so back to life. How many were saved, no man ever knew, for in that theater of heroism none stood by to tally, but ever at the head of the line of life, ever playing a man's part, that man of men was Mataafa. As men were rescued, they were hurried to the chief's house where his wife worked with her maids to help the men. So, was war prevented? Yeah. After the hurricane, the Berlin Act was signed to allow for neutrality of Samoa, but in 1899 the U.S. annexed Eastern Samoa and Germany annexed Western Samoa. Things weren't great. Western Samoans weren't happy with the German governor trying to change things. New Zealand troops came in August 1914 and occupied Western Samoa without any fighting, but then they were accused of negligence when 1/5 of the population died from the flu. Samoans didn't want foreign rule. The League of Nations in 1920 gave New Zealand power over in Western Samoa, and then some stuff happened. In 1962, Western Samoa gained its political independence. In 1997, the name changed from Western Samoa to Samoa. American Samoa is not incorporated by the U.S., and there is not an act giving them a system of government. In 1967, they were given the authority to have their own constitution, and a governor was appointed by the U.S. government. In 1976, they were allowed to have an election for a governor and lieutenant governor, It appears that all other government-type officials, like Chief Justice and other justices, are appointed by the U.S. Secretary of the Interior. They have a bicameral legislature. The U.S. is responsible for defense of Samoa. In the upcoming slides will be a list of the victims of the tragedy. Thank you all for your service, and rest in peace.